Hi there. We've previously discussed the Anglo-Boer War with regard to the rifles used by the Boers and the carbines used by the Boers. Today I'm going to have a different tack. We're going to talk about the rifles and carbines used by the British and colonial forces during the Boer War of 1899-1902. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a broad overview. It's not a specific talk about any particular rifle. As we all know, the Lee Enfield Mark I, Mark I Star, the Martini Henry Mark I, Mark II, Mark III. I'm not going into that sort of detail. This is just a broad overview of the different types of weapons, or should I say rifles and carbines, used by the Brits. Now, normally when you talk about the Boer War, one tends to associate the Lee Metford, the Lee Enfield and the Mauser. However, today I'm going to kick off with the Martini Henry, the trusted old Martini Henry .577, .450. It saw sterling service. It was introduced in 1871. It was served in British forces in India, in Africa, throughout the empire, in Victoria's small wars, played a huge role. Now, during the Boer War, it was totally obsolete. It was a single-shot rifle. We do know, as I mentioned before, the Boers were using Martini Henrys. They used a lot of Wesley Richards improved Martinis. The British troops were mainly, armed with the Lee Metford and Lee Enfield. The colonial troops initially with the Martini Enfield and Martini Metfords, and eventually with the Lee Enfields and Lee Metfords. Now, why the Martini Henry? Why should I talk about Martini Henry in the Boer War? Well, there were thousands that were used. If you look at the photographic evidence, all the small town guards, or a lot of the small town guards, and there, by the way, were over 110 of the different town guards, were armed initially with Martini Henrys, Martini carbines, Martini Enfields, Martini Metfords, anything that they could get their hands on. Basically, after the initial stages of the Boer War, there were invasions of the Cape Colony by various Boer generals. There was Hertzog, there was Christian de Wet, and finally Jan Smuts was by far the most successful invasion of the Cape Colony. He got right down almost as far as Cape Town and then turned west and went up to the close to the German Southwest African border. Now, as a result of that, the Cape Colony and Natal started arming small little town guards. They created town guards, and these were the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers, all the guys who could be called up to defend the town in case of a Boer attack. Now, many of them were never attacked, but there certainly were several town guards that were seen in action, where Boer, especially with Jan Smuts invading the Cape Colony, they were called out, the town guards, to tackle these Boers. So, as I said before, you'll see plenty of photographs of guys with Martini Henrys in town guards. Also, towards the end of the war, the British, with their blockhouses, were arming black troops, often with Martini Henrys. So you'll see the Martini Henrys. Every now and again, you'll see a pattern 1876 bayonet. There was also the pattern 1887 bayonet, which I have here behind me. So yes, they were certainly used. Mainly the rifles, but also the carbines, probably to a lesser extent. So Martini Henry carbines, what we have here is an artillery carbine. I think they're a magnificent little weapon. As you know, it takes the really long pattern 1879 artillery swordback bayonet, which we'll show you with the saw teeth on it. I can't prove the days were used during the Boer War, but there's a good possibility that there might have been. As I said, with the town guards, basically they would grab whatever weapons were available. And certainly there would have been Martini Henry carbines in the armories throughout the country. Later on in the years, they were even issued to cadets, so I'm quite sure that they did see some service. In 1888, the British finally made a move towards a smaller caliber rifle. The Germans and many other nations, the Americans, had long since gone to a smaller caliber. So the British in 1888 introduced the Lee Metford rifle, and it took a pattern 1888 bayonet. In fact, the first bayonets, while we're talking about bayonets, was this particular bayonet. As opposed to the later models, it had 3 brass rivets, which was the original Lee Metford bayonet that went with the rifle. Now, unfortunately, in my collection, I don't have a Lee Metford rifle. I wish I did. It had a straight stack magazine with 8 rounds in it. They had a small problem with the Lee Metford in as much as it was fouling. After a while, there was fouling in the barrels and there was wear, so they introduced in 1890 1905 they introduced the Lee Enfield, which was an improvement on the Lee Metford, the difference being the barrel. Now, talking about Metfords, in 1894 the British introduced a short version of the Lee Metford. What I have here is a Lee Metford carbine. It's dated 1895, this one. It's in beautiful condition. We've discussed this before. This particular carbine, and as you can see, it's got the little sling bar in the butt. The later ones, the Lee Enfield, or should I say the Enfield carbines, didn't have the sling bar in the butt. It's got a 6-shot magazine. Like the Lee Metford, it's got the single shot cutout, which we've got here. They were obviously only issued to cavalry. It was a cavalry type carbine, and there was a scabbard which was used together with this on horseback. So issued to the cavalry, short little, very neat little weapon, I think. It was purposely done like this with the wings to protect the front sight, so that you could slide it into the scabbard, and also you can see the bolt was turned down and shaved off. So it was trying to be as smooth as possible to handle it on horseback. So that was the Lee Metford carbine. Now in 1895, as I said, due to the fouling problem, Enfield came up with the Lee Enfield rifle, which basically was an improvement on the Lee Metford. Looks very much the same. They went to the 10-shot magazine as opposed to the single stack 8-shot magazine on the Lee Metford rifle. Very much the same. It's got the dust cover. It's got the magazine cut off like the Lee Metford have. This is a 1900 model. I've even got a sight protector on this particular one. It took the same model bayonet, the pattern 1888. However, there were 2 modifications. The earlier one, pattern 88 bayonet, which I'll show you here. We'll show you on the picture as well. Very neat bayonet. The Mark II version had the oil hole here next to the second rivet, and the 2 brass rivets were slightly closer together. I've got one of those, and we'll show you one. This is the later model with the oil hole in the pommel. So this is the bayonet that fitted the Lee Enfield and the Lee Metford. This particular rifle still had the long-range volley sight, which you can see here, and the flip-up volley sight at the back here, which you can see. So this was a 303 once again, and it saw extensive service. Towards the end of the war, the majority of the British troops and colonials were using the Lee Metford, should I say the Lee Enfield rifle in .303 caliber. As mentioned, there were many of these Martini Enfields in both the rifle and the carbine that were lying around in armories, and they would most certainly have been used in the likes of the town guards, pressed into service. And as I said, being a .303 caliber, the same as the Lee Metford and Lee Enfield, they didn't have an ammunition problem. Now, I must mention a rather unusual feature about the Martini Enfield rifle. It took a modified pattern 1876 bayonet for the Martini Henry. This is a pattern 1895, and it was, to the best of my knowledge, the only British bayonet that fitted in this particular way. As opposed to the Martini Henry, the bayonet fits below the rifle. So on the Martini Henry, the bayonet fits on the right-hand side of the rifle, and in this instance it sits directly below the barrel at the end of the rifle, which is quite unusual for a British arm. So that's a pattern 1895 socket bayonet for the Martini Enfield rifle. Whether any of these were used in the Boer War is not known by me. They weren't very popular. They were rather unwieldy, and they certainly, as I said, were not very popular, so more than likely they weren't used. Okay, now I'm going to talk about another little carbine which I particularly enjoy. This is the Martini Enfield artillery carbine. Now there was a cavalry carbine as well. This is the artillery version. It takes the pattern 88 bayonet. As I mentioned, this is the later version. This is a 1902 version with the oil hole in the pommel. Lovely little weapon, very neat. Used by the artillery, but once again pressed into service during the Boer War, I'm quite sure, in the town guards, district mounted troops. There were over 60-odd district mounted troops that were formed in many of the farming areas. Once again, initially they didn't have Lee Metfords and Lee Enfields, so they would have used whatever was available. Well, that's about all I can tell you about the different weapons used by the British and colonial troops, and I hope you've enjoyed the chat. Thank you.